Having your own home server rack or home lab is really useful, but you have to have a fairly large space to set it up. It generates a lot of heat and it can be quite noisy. So that's why I built this, the world's smallest server rack, and it fits right in on my desk alongside a drink or cup of coffee. It runs Docker, so it can handle a number of containerized network applications. It's also got a built-in UPS to carry it through a power outage for about an hour or so, and it's got an SSD which is used for file and media storage. So let me show you how I made it. This project came about because when I've made up a case for my Raspberry Pi to house a UPS, then people have asked me to add an SSD. And when I've made one up for an SSD, then people have asked me to add a UPS. The problem is that both of these boards are designed to sit directly underneath the Raspberry Pi. The UPS because it uses these pogo pins to connect to the Pi's GPIO pins, and the SSD shield because of the jumper to hook it up to the Pi's USB ports. So this got me thinking of a way to mount all three on top of each other. And the solution that came to mind is some sort of rack mount enclosure, although these don't exist in sizes suitable for a Raspberry Pi. So I decided to design my own. I designed the rack in Fusion 360 to look somewhat like a server rack that would be used for a typical home lab. It's got a tinted acrylic swing door on the front and tinted acrylic side panels. The top, bottom and back are all solid panels, with the back having a cable entry point, and the top having a 40mm fan for cooling. Inside we've got space for 3 racks, one for the Pi, one for the UPS, and one for the SSD. I'm also going to mount an OLED display alongside the Pi to provide some stats on resource usage on the server. With the design done, I 3D printed the parts in black PLA. While they were printing, I also cut the door and 2 side panels from 3mm grey tinted acrylic. So those are all the components for the housing made up. Now we just need to add the racks to it to hold the electronics. The SSD will be on its own rack at the bottom, as this can be plugged in or removed using a USB cable or jumper. I'm using an M.2 NGFF shield with a 256GB Western Digital SSD. The UPS I'm using is the Pi Sugar 3 Plus. This has a 5000 mAh battery which can run the Pi alone for around 5 hours, but with the SSD connected as well as the fan and display running, I expect this to go down to about an hour or 2. It can handle a continuous output of up to 3 amps, so it'll have no trouble supplying power to the additional equipment and the SSD as well. The UPS is a bit more complicated because of the pogo pins, so you can't just slide it in underneath the Pi. It has to be physically screwed onto the bottom of the Pi, so I'm going to have to combine these 2 racks. The racks are going to be made of 2mm black acrylic, which I'm going to bend at the front. So I drew up these 2 flat patterns in Inkscape to laser cut. You could also 3D print these trays, but it takes a minute to cut them both from acrylic, rather than a few hours to 3D print them. So it's easier to make changes or adjustments if I need to. To bend the acrylic, I'm using an acrylic bending tool to heat up a line along the bottom. Once the acrylic is soft, we can then bend the front up and use a 90-degree bracket to make sure that the bend comes out square. And we can do the same for the second rack. Now we've got all of our parts made up and we can move on to assembling our mini server. First we need to melt some threaded brass inserts into the 3D printed base and hinge for our assembly screws. To do this, we'll use a soldering iron set higher than the melting point of our filament. We've got 4 M2.5 inserts for the top cover screws, 6 more for the racks, 2 for the cable cover at the back, and finally 2 M2 brass inserts on the hinge for the hinge pins. Now let's install our components onto the racks. We'll start by mounting the SSD shield onto the bottom rack. The SSD shield is held in place using the 6mm brass standoffs that came with it, and then an M2.5 nut on the bottom of each. We can then slide the SSD rack into place at the bottom and secure it with 2 M2.5 screws. I'm still going to use the USB jumper that came with it, but I'll use this on the Pi, and then use a short USB jumper with a 90-degree cable to connect to the SSD. Now let's move on to the UPS and Pi rack. I was initially going to use the included nylon screws and some 6mm standoffs to mount the Pi on the rack, but to fit the OLED display next to it, I needed the Pi to be at the top. So I'm going to replace the nylon screws with stainless steel screws for additional strength, and I'm going to use 2 12mm standoffs for each leg to the rack. The battery also doesn't fit between the legs, so I'm going to leave off one of the front legs so that there's enough room for it to fit in underneath the Pi. The OLED display is just held in place using 2 M2x16mm screws at the top, and is held in place along the bottom using a cutout through the rack. The SSD's USB jumper plugs into the front of the Pi, and then I'm using the short USB extension cable to plug into the SSD. We can then hold the Pi assembly in place with some M2.5 nuts. I'm going to use a short female-to-female ribbon cable to plug the display into the Pi's ground, 3.3 volts and I to C pins. I'm also going to add a heatsink to the Pi to assist with cooling. Before we slide the Pi rack into place, let's add the battery and plug it into the UPS. The Pi rack is then also held in place with some M2.5 screws, using 2 per rack unit. Next we can mount the fan onto the top cover. I'm using a 5V Noctua fan for this to keep it nice and quiet. I'm going to mount it on the underside of the cover with some M3x16mm screws so that it's pulling the warm air out of the case. I've added a short pair of breadboard jumpers to adapt the connector on the fan to fit the Pi's GPIO pins. I'm going to use 5V and ground for these. To make up the door, we need to glue the acrylic sheets into the recess along the hinge, which we can do with some super glue. Then I made up some adjustable hinge pins by cutting the heads off some M2 screws. We can then screw these into the brass inserts and then screw them in or out to position the door correctly within the frame. The USB-C power cable runs through the cable entry hole at the back and then up to the Pi. We can then close up the cable entry cover. I made this hole much bigger than what's required for the USB-C cable, so that I can add an HDMI cable or Ethernet cable in future if I'd like to use those ports on the Pi. The side panels are just held in place using the guides that are 3D printed into the main body of the rack, so they're easily removable if you need to get to the ports on the side of the Pi or to the GPIO pins. Then we can close up the top cover with 4 more M2.5 by 6mm screws. And that's it complete, so we can now get the software loaded and booted up. I also 3D printed a cover for the USB jumper. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm running Docker on this Pi, so I've got all of my applications running in containers. This makes it really easy to experiment with applications and services. I've even got my stats display running in a container, which I've also made available on GitHub. The Pi Sugar UPS also has a dashboard that's available through a web page on the network. I really like that you can access a range of settings and controls remotely. You can use the Pi Sugar's built-in real-time clock to schedule awake time, and you can also add custom button functions and set the battery level that'll trigger a safe shutdown, and even extend the battery life by not charging it to its full capacity. There are also a bunch of commands that you can use in scripts in the Pi to get information from or modify settings on the UPS. The only thing I think is missing from the dashboard is a reboot or shutdown button to allow you to remotely reboot or shut down the Pi. Other than that, the server seems happy to run entirely on battery power from the UPS, even with the fan and SSD connected. I'm really happy with how this project has come out. There are a couple of things I still want to try, like adding a low profile 90-degree Ethernet cable to the Pi so that I can rather use a hardwired network connection, and I'd like to try swap the heatsink out for a slightly larger one. The stats script also seems to lock up after a while. I assume because it's conflicting with the I2C interface on the UPS, so I need to look into a fix for this. Let me know what you think of the build in the comment section below, and let me know what other things you'd like to see me include in a rack design for a future build. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more tech and electronics projects, tutorials and reviews.